That's my daughter. The dust kicked up by 47 pairs of boots created a choking cloud that hung in the still desert air like a harbinger of doom. In the center of Millfield's main street, a hastily constructed wooden post stood stark against the blazing Arizona sun, its shadow a dark line pointing toward the girl who knelt in the dirt with her hands bound behind her back. Sarah McKenna had known this day would come. For 3 months she had lived among these people, shared their meals, attended their church services, and listened to their children's laughter echoing through the small frontier town. But she had always known that her secret would eventually surface, like a body in a shallow grave that the rains inevitably uncover. The crowd pressed closer, their faces a mixture of righteous anger and morbid curiosity. Women clutched their children to their skirts while men fingered the ropes coiled at their belts. Someone had fashioned crude shackles from blacksmith's iron, heavy, rust-flecked bands that would bite into young flesh and leave permanent scars, assuming the girl survived what was to come. Thief. The word cut through the morning air like a blade. Martha Henley, the general store owner's wife, pointed an accusing finger at Sarah. She's been stealing from us for months. Taking food, taking coins, taking anything she could get her dirty hands on. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, growing louder with each repetition of the accusation. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the ground, watching ants scurry between the scattered pebbles. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear, though her heart hammered so hard against her ribs that she wondered if everyone could hear it. "Found her hiding in the root cellar behind the church," announced Deputy Morrison, a thin man whose authority seemed to grow only in proportion to the size of the mob behind him. "Had a whole cache of stolen goods down there. Preserved meat, canned peaches, silver dollars, even some of Miss Patterson's jewelry." The crowd's anger intensified. Voices called out punishments that grew increasingly harsh: a public whipping, tar and feathers, banishment to the desert without water. But it was old Judge Crawford who suggested the change. "Let her be secured to the post for 3 days and 3 nights, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of biblical judgment. "Let her feel the sun's fire by day and the desert's ice by night. Let her understand what it means to take from those who work honest for their keep." Crawford was not an official judge. That title was more honorary than legal, in a town too small and too remote for formal courts. But he owned the largest ranch in the county and had been the first to settle here when this was still Comanche territory. His word carried the force of law simply because there was no other law to be found for 100 miles in any direction. 3 days seems merciful," called out Tom Morrison, the deputy's brother. "Stealing's a hanging offense in most places." "The girl's barely 15, Judge Crawford replied, though his tone held no particular sympathy. "We're not savages here. 3 days chained to the post, then she leaves our town forever. She won't survive long in the desert, but at least we won't have her blood directly on our hands." Sarah finally raised her head. At 15, she had already lived through more hardship than most of these townspeople would experience in their entire lives. Her parents had died of typhoid when she was 12, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that had little patience for orphaned children. She had learned to steal because stealing meant survival, and survival was the only thing that mattered when you had nothing else left. The irony was that she had actually been trying to leave Millfield when they caught her. The stolen goods weren't for her continued presence in the town, but for her journey elsewhere. Food for the road, coins to buy passage on a wagon train, anything that might help her reach California, where she had heard there were opportunities for people willing to work hard regardless of their past. But explanations were useless now. The crowd had already decided her guilt and her punishment. All that remained was the execution of their frontier justice. Deputy Morrison stepped forward with the iron shackles, their weight evident in the way he carried them. "Hold still, girl. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face. Margaret McKenna had been a gentle woman with calloused hands and a voice like honey. When she sang lullabies, She had taught Sarah to read using a worn Bible and to write using charcoal on flat stone. More importantly, she had taught her daughter that dignity was something that could never be stolen, only surrendered. "I won't surrender it," Sarah whispered to herself, the words lost in the crowd's noise. The iron was cold against her wrists despite the desert heat. Deputy Morrison worked with the efficiency of a man who had done similar work before, though perhaps never on someone so young. The shackles clicked into place with a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings like a death knell. "Lord have mercy on her soul," murmured someone in the crowd, though whether they meant it as prayer or epitaph was unclear. Judge Crawford raised his hand for silence. "The sentence will begin at noon when the sun reaches its peak. Until then, the girl will remain under guard. Anyone who interferes with this lawful punishment will face the same penalty." Lawful. The word tasted bitter in Sarah's mouth. There was nothing lawful about mob justice. But in places like Millfield, the law was whatever the powerful decided it should be, and she was powerless. A parentless girl with no family to speak for her, no property to give her standing, no voice that anyone felt obligated to hear. The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered nearby, reluctant to miss the spectacle of the actual chaining. Children were shooed away by their mothers, but Sarah noticed several of them peeking around corners and through windows. This would be a story they would tell for years to come. The day they saw a thief get what she deserved. Deputy Morrison stationed himself in the shade of the general store, close enough to prevent any attempt at escape but far enough away to avoid the worst of the sun's glare. He pulled out a piece of jerky and began to chew it methodically, as if guarding a condemned child was just another part of his daily routine. The sun climbed steadily toward its zenith. Sarah could feel its heat intensifying with each passing minute, and she wasn't even secured to the post yet. 3 days of this would be a slow, agonizing death. The human body could survive perhaps 3 days without water under normal conditions, but in the desert heat, chained to a post without shade, even the strongest person would likely perish within 2 days. Judge Crawford knew this, just as everyone else did. They were sentencing her to death, while maintaining the fiction that they were showing mercy. As the morning wore on, Sarah found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. She could have tried to find work as a domestic servant somewhere, though opportunities for children without references were scarce. She could have thrown herself on the mercy of the church, though most churches were struggling to feed their own congregations and had little to spare for orphans. She could have resigned herself to starvation, which would have been a slower but perhaps more dignified death than what awaited her. But she had chosen to steal because she had chosen to live, and given the same circumstances, she knew she would make the same choice again. The town's church bell tolled 11 times, each chime seeming to count down the minutes remaining in her life. Deputy Morrison straightened up and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Soon he would have to drag her to the post and secure the chains to the iron rings that had been hastily hammered into the wood. Soon her real suffering would begin. It was then that she heard the sound of horse hooves on the hard-packed dirt of the main street. The rider approached slowly, deliberately, in the manner of someone who was in no particular hurry, but had serious business to conduct. Sarah couldn't see him clearly from her position, but she could tell he was a large man on a large horse, and something about his presence caused the lingering townspeople to step back and fall silent. "Afternoon, Mr. McKenna," Deputy Morrison called out, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. McKenna. Her father's name had been Patrick McKenna, but he had died 3 years ago in a town 200 miles to the south. This had to be a coincidence. McKenna was not an uncommon name, especially in territories that had seen Irish immigration. The rider dismounted with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. He was indeed a large man, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and the kind of deep tan that came from decades of outdoor work. His clothes were well made but practical: sturdy boots, canvas pants, a cotton shirt that had seen many washings, but was still clean and mended. This was a man of some means, but not one who felt the need to display his wealth ostentatiously. "Deputy," the man said, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent that made Sarah's heart race. I hear you've got some excitement planned for today. Justice, Mr. McKenna, Deputy Morrison corrected. We're administering justice to a thief who's been preying on our good people. The man called McKenna walked slowly toward where Sarah knelt in the dirt. His boots made no sound on the packed earth, and she had the strange impression that he was a man accustomed to moving quietly when he chose to. When he stopped directly in front of her, she finally raised her eyes to look at him. The shock of recognition was like a physical blow. The eyes were the same pale blue as her father's, set in a face that shared the same strong jaw and prominent cheekbone. This man was older than her father had been when he died, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Either this was some unknown relative, or the desert heat was already causing her to hallucinate. What's your name, child? He asked quietly. Sarah, she whispered, then cleared her throat and spoke more clearly. Sarah McKenna. Something shifted in the man's expression, surprise, recognition, or perhaps just calculation. He studied her face for a long moment, and she found herself cataloguing the similarities between his features and her own. The same stubborn chin, the same straight nose, the same way of tilting the head slightly when thinking. McKenna, he repeated slowly. And where are your people from, Sarah McKenna? Dead, she said simply. Typhoid took them 3 years ago in Copper Creek. The man's face went very still. Patrick McKenna of Copper Creek. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. How could this stranger know her father's name? The man was quiet for so long that Deputy Morrison began to shift nervously. The crowd, sensing that something significant was happening but not understanding what, pressed closer despite the heat. Finally, the man spoke again. Patrick McKenna was my brother. The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. Uncle. She had an uncle, and he was here, and he was clearly a man of some standing in this community. But 3 years too late, 3 years of hunger and theft, and sleeping in barns and root cellars, and now her family had found her only in time to watch her die. Your brother? Deputy Morrison sounded skeptical. You never mentioned having a brother. Patrick and I had a falling out many years ago, McKenna replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. Stupid pride on both sides. I heard he'd died, but I didn't know he'd left a daughter. Judge Crawford had approached during this exchange, drawn by the murmur of conversation. This doesn't change anything, McKenna, he said firmly. The girl's a thief. She's been stealing from our people for months. The sentence stands. Sarah's uncle, she still couldn't quite believe it, turned to face the judge. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an undertone of authority that made everyone within earshot pay attention. What exactly did she steal? Food, mostly, Deputy Morrison answered. Some preserves, dried meat, a few coins from the church collection box. Found some jewelry too, though she claims she didn't take that. The jewelry was my mother's, Sarah said quickly. The only thing I had left of her. I never stole jewelry from anyone. Likely story, Judge Crawford snorted. McKenna ignored the judge and focused on the deputy. How much food? How much money? Maybe $20 worth. All told. But that's not the point. $20. McKenna reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out coins slowly, deliberately, letting each one fall into his palm with a soft clink. Here's $40. Double compensation for anything she took, plus damages for the inconvenience. Money doesn't erase the crime, Judge Crawford protested. Doesn't it? McKenna's voice grew harder. Seems to me that if a starving child takes food to survive and full restitution is made, the matter should be settled. Unless you think keeping orphans alive is somehow morally objectionable. The crowd murmured uneasily. When the crime was described as stealing food to avoid starvation, it sounded different than when it was simply called theft. Several people were already starting to look uncomfortable with the situation. She could have asked for help, Judge Crawford insisted. We're charitable people here. Are you? McKenna's question hung in the air like a challenge. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're about to torture a 15-year-old girl to death for the crime of not wanting to starve. The law, Judge Crawford began. What law? McKenna's voice cut through the judge's words like a knife. Show me the statute that says theft by a starving orphan is punishable by death. Show me the court that tried this case and the jury that convicted her. Show me anything that makes this lawful beyond your say-so. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Everyone knew that McKenna was right. What they were doing was mob justice, not legal justice. But admitting that would mean admitting that they were prepared to murder a child to satisfy their sense of righteous anger. It was then that McKenna played his trump card. Besides which, he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more threat than shouting would have. That's my daughter you're talking about chaining to a post. The words hit the crowd like a physical force. Sarah felt her own mouth fall open in shock. Daughter? Your daughter? Judge Crawford sputtered. You just said she was your brother's child. My brother is dead, McKenna replied calmly. His daughter is now my daughter. By blood, by law, and by my choosing. And I don't take kindly to people who threaten my family. Deputy Morrison was looking increasingly nervous. Now see here, McKenna. We didn't know. Didn't know what? That she might have family? That someone might care what happened to her? You didn't bother to ask, did you? Just grabbed a defenseless child and decided to make an example of her. Sarah stared at this man who claimed to be her uncle. This stranger who was calling her his daughter and facing down an angry mob on her behalf. She didn't understand his motivations. They had never met. He owed her nothing, and acknowledging their relationship would bring him no benefit and potential trouble. But he was doing it anyway. The point remains, Judge Crawford said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction, that she committed theft. She can't just be allowed to go free. I agree, McKenna said, surprising everyone. She'll face appropriate consequences. She'll work on my ranch to pay off her debt to the community. She'll learn skills that will allow her to make an honest living, and she'll be supervised to ensure she doesn't repeat her mistakes. That's justice. What you were planning was just cruelty dressed up in righteous language. And if we don't agree to your proposal? Judge Crawford asked. McKenna's smile was thin and cold. Well, Judge, I think you'll find that hurting my daughter would be a very poor decision. I employ a lot of people in this county. I buy supplies from most of the businesses in this town. I'm a major taxpayer and a significant voice in territorial politics, and I have a long memory for people who wrong my family. The threat was delivered quietly, almost casually, but its implications were clear. McKenna had the economic and political power to make life very difficult for anyone who opposed him. Judge Crawford might style himself the authority in Millfield, but McKenna's influence extended far beyond the town's borders. Sarah watched the judge's face as he calculated the costs and benefits of pressing forward with the punishment. She could see the moment when he realized that backing down might be humiliating, but proceeding would be catastrophic. Very well, Crawford said finally. The girl will be released to your custody, but if she steals again, she won't, McKenna said firmly. I guarantee it. Deputy Morrison moved forward to unlock the shackles from Sarah's wrist. The iron had already begun to chafe, and she rubbed the red marks absently as she tried to process what had just happened. One moment she had been facing death by torture. The next, she was apparently the daughter of a wealthy rancher. The crowd began to disperse, most people looking disappointed that they wouldn't get to witness the spectacle they had been anticipating. A few nodded approvingly at McKenna, as if they had never really supported the harsh punishment anyway. Others muttered darkly about preferential treatment for the rich and connected. When the street had largely cleared, McKenna helped Sarah to her feet. She was unsteady after kneeling for so long, and her legs were stiff from the uncomfortable position. Can you ride? He asked. Yes, sir. Good. We've got a long way to go. As they walked toward his horse, Sarah found her voice. Why? She asked. Why did you help me? You don't even know me. McKenna was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on his horse's neck. Your father and I quarreled over a woman when we were young men, he said finally. Stupid thing, really. She married neither of us and moved back east. But we were too proud to make peace, and too stubborn to admit we'd been fooled. Then he died, and I thought I'd lost the chance to make things right. He looked at her then, really looked at her,
as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You have his eyes," he said softly, "and his stubborn chin. I failed my brother, but I won't fail his daughter." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed in years. "I really am sorry," she said. "For the stealing, I mean. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just didn't know what else to do." "I know," he said gently. "Survival makes criminals of us all sometime, but you don't have to survive on your own anymore." He boosted her up onto his horse's back, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of Millfield, Sarah looked back once at the wooden post that had so nearly become the site of her death. The iron rings glinted in the afternoon sun, like malevolent eyes. "What's your ranch like?" she asked, as the town fell away behind them. "Big," McKenna replied. "Bigger than you can probably imagine. Cattle, horses, good water, and plenty of work for anyone willing to do it. You'll have your own room, proper clothes, regular meals, and we'll find you a tutor so you can continue your education." "Education? Your father was a learned man, even if he was too proud for his own good. I suspect his daughter has the same potential. Besides, reading and writing and arithmetic are useful skills on a ranch. Somebody has to keep the books and correspond with buyers and government officials." The idea of an education, real education, not just the rudimentary reading and writing her mother had taught her, was almost too wonderful to contemplate. For 3 years she had focused entirely on immediate survival, finding food, finding shelter, avoiding danger. The possibility of thinking about the future, of making plans beyond the next day or week, was revolutionary. "Will people know?" she asked. "About what I did, I mean." "Some will," McKenna said honestly. "Word travels fast in these parts. But they'll also know that you're under my protection now, and that you're working to make amends." Most folks respect honest effort to reform. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the desert landscape rolling past them in waves of red rock and scattered scrub. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah had never really had time to appreciate before. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Of course. When you said I was your daughter, did you mean, or were you just trying to scare them off?" McKenna considered the question seriously. "Both, I suppose. Legally speaking, you're my niece and my ward. But family isn't just about blood, Sarah. It's about choosing to care for someone, to protect them, to help them become the best version of themselves. If you're willing, I'd like to be the father you lost. Not to replace Patrick, no one could do that, but to give you what a father should: guidance, support, unconditional love, and a place to belong." The tears came freely now, streaming down Sarah's face as years of suppressed grief and loneliness finally found release. She had survived by hardening herself, by refusing to feel the full weight of her losses, but now, with safety finally within reach, she could allow herself to mourn the little girl she had been before hunger and desperation had forced her to become someone else. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." "Then it's settled," McKenna said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Welcome home, daughter." As they rode toward the setting sun, Sarah McKenna, no longer an orphan, no longer a thief, no longer alone, began to imagine a future that stretched beyond mere survival. For the first time in 3 years, she dared to hope that tomorrow might be better than today. Behind them, the town of Millfield grew smaller and smaller, until it disappeared entirely into the desert haze. The wooden post stood empty, its iron rings serving no purpose now, except as a reminder of how close justice had come to becoming vengeance, and how a single word, daughter, had changed everything. The desert wind picked up, scattering the dust that 47 pairs of boots had raised in their pursuit of frontier justice. By morning, even that evidence would be gone, blown away across the endless landscape, as if the whole episode had been nothing more than a fever dream born of heat and collective madness. But for Sarah McKenna, riding toward her new life on the back of her uncle's horse, the memory would remain forever. The day she learned that family could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes salvation comes not from God or government or good intentions, but from a quiet rancher who decides that blood is thicker than mob rule, and that love is stronger than law. The ranch appeared on the horizon, just as the last light was fading from the sky. A collection of buildings nestled in a valley between two low hills, with the silver thread of a stream running alongside. Lights flickered in the windows, warm and welcoming, and Sarah could see figures moving about in the yard attending to the evening chores. Home, McKenna said simply. And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah McKenna truly understood what that word meant.